So let's begin by talking about the first of the big three theories, structural functionalism. Now, if you're like me, I'm a very visual learner, so I have three different images on the left here, and each of them pertains to one of these specific theories of the big three that we're going to be covering today. So starting with structural functionalism. Functionalists' basic understanding of society is that society is a machine, or an organism, some people compare it to, meaning that both machines and organisms are made up of interrelated parts that work together to function. When all parts of a society fulfill their functions, when all members of society, all of the structures in the society are operating smoothly and doing what they're expected to do, society is in a normal state that's called equilibrium. Structural functionalists argue that we should always strive to have equilibrium in our society because when society is at equilibrium, when everyone is functioning smoothly and doing what they're expected, society works like a machine. All of the cogs in the machine work and rotate in the same way, and when everyone is doing their job, every cog is doing exactly what it's expected to do, society runs smoothly, and that's a good thing for us because we don't want a lot of chaos in our lives, right? When we have chaos in our lives, things get bad, right? When parts of society do not fulfill their function, society becomes dysfunctional. So imagine, I have these cogs over here as an image. Imagine if I took a wrench and smashed one of those cogs down and broke one of them so it stopped spinning. What would happen to this entire inner workings of this machine? It would stop, right? It wouldn't work anymore because one cog was dysfunctional. The entire system, the entire society would therefore become dysfunctional. So that's the basis of structural functionism. Society is like a machine. All the groups in society, all of the social structures in a society have a set of expectations about them, a set of roles that they're expected to fill. And as long as all of the structures and groups in society are functioning smoothly and doing what's expected of them, society as a whole operates smoothly. And that's a good thing. That's what we want. We do not want dysfunctionality in our society. We want equilibrium. That's the basis of structural functionalism. So to provide a specific definition, a function refers to the beneficial consequences of people's actions that maintain society. Okay? The beneficial consequences of people's actions that maintain society. As a teacher, I am serving my function to you right now by sharing knowledge, sharing information, and trying to educate you, right? That is the expectation of my behavior, and that is of my role as a teacher. And when I meet that expectation, I'm furthering the benefits of our larger education structure in society by sharing knowledge with my students, right? A dysfunction, on the flip side, are the negative consequences of people's actions that disrupt society. Now, a dysfunction of teaching might be, for example, if I really didn't care about this presentation and I decided that I was just going to click through all these slides as quickly as I can and not explain anything, just because I didn't want to do it, right? I might cause a dysfunction in our education system, right? I might get a number of students that are very upset with my quality of instruction and start complaining to the dean of the college. And then I might get fired, and then there might not be anybody to teach this class. So hundreds of students would go without a teacher for this course, and it would create a lot of chaos and disrupt a lot of the normalcy within our education structure here at TAM-UCC, right? So virtually every aspect of society, every social structure in society, every group in society is expected to have a proper function according to structural functionalism. Structural functionalists can even argue that things in our society that seem to be completely negative, things that you would think there's no way could have any benefits for society, actually still become an integral and important component of a largely functional society. So think, for example, how might crime be considered both functional and dysfunctional for society? How might crime be both good and bad for society as a whole? Think about that for a minute. Well, it's pretty obvious how crime can be very dysfunctional for a society, right? If someone robs a bank, for an example, a lot of people's money could be stolen. Workers at that bank could experience a lot of trauma if they were robbed at gunpoint. It could create a lot of chaos in that particular society. If someone runs a red light, commits the crime of, breaking a traffic violation, they could cause a car accident, which could obviously cause physical harm to people, but that car accident could also cause a major traffic jam. So hundreds of people might be late for work. They might have to miss doctor's appointments or be late picking up their kids from soccer practice, right? So it's pretty clear to see how crime can cause a lot of dysfunction, have a lot of negative consequences, and disrupt society. But how might crime also be functional for society? How could crime be beneficial for society in some ways? Well, a structural functionalist would argue that crime creates jobs, right? If we didn't have any crime in our society, we'd have no need for police officers or parole officers or prison guards, right? So having crime in society is good in the sense that it produces a lot of jobs, which provide stable incomes for people of varying levels of education. So a structural functionalist is always going to try and understand how any behavior in society, any group or structure in society is functional. What is their basic function? If something is built into the fabric of our society, like crime is today, there has to be some explanation as to why it continues to exist, or we as a society would try and alter our society to get rid of crime altogether. So a functionalist would argue that we as a society have become complacent and accepting of having crime being part of our everyday life because it serves a bigger function. In this case, it produces jobs for many people. That's a structural functionalist argument. So functionalists also argue that functions can have both intended and unintended consequences to their actions. The manifest functions refer to the intended beneficial consequences of people's actions, while the latent functions are the unintended beneficial consequences of people's actions, right? So a good example of this is elementary schools, all right? Teaching in elementary schools. A manifest function of having elementary schools in our society is that it teaches young children the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? That is the intended beneficial consequence of having elementary schools in our society. A latent function, so an unintended beneficial consequence of having elementary schools, is that it provides free childcare for parents, right? So this was not the intention of establishing elementary schools. That was not the intended benefit of having elementary schools in our society, but it became an unintended beneficial consequences. Elementary schools provided free childcare for parents, and this became increasingly important, especially as we moved into a society that had dual income families, right? This allowed women to now go out into the workforce and work the same as men, which is a really important factor in increasing equality in terms of gender in the workforce, and it's largely a result of elementary schools. Women previously were not allowed to go into the workforce because they were expected to stay home and take care of their children and teach their children at home. But when we developed elementary schools as a result of the Industrial Revolution, women all of a sudden had free time. They didn't need to stay home the entire day to raise their children because their children were out being supervised in school, which allowed women to enter the workforce. So that was an unintended beneficial consequence of elementary schools, which is a latent function. We also have these things called latent dysfunctions, which are the unintended negative consequences of people's actions. Okay, so a latent dysfunction of elementary schools might be that they teach children to be fearful of authoritative figures at a young age, right? Now, some people might argue that that's a good thing to teach children to obey their teachers, to respect their elders. But some people on the flip side might argue that it's actually dysfunctional. When we teach children from such a young age that they need to be obedient to authoritarian figures, that they need to be subservient to people who have power over them, it can cause people to be really resistant to actually fight for and advocate for things in terms of social movements and social change, right? If everyone in our society was completely terrified of authoritative figures, we would live in like a totalitarianism society where individuals would never feel the freedom of speech, the right to protest or to advocate or fight for the rights of groups that are oppressed or marginalized. So a latent dysfunction of elementary schools could be that it teaches children to be fearful of authoritative figures instead of having their own voices as autonomous individuals. Another classic example that's always used to discuss manifest functions, latent functions, and latent dysfunctions is the light switch. All right, so consider this. What is the manifest function of turning on a light in a dark room? What could be a potential latent function of turning a light on in a dark room? And what could be a latent dysfunction of this action? So think about this. This is kind of a riddle here. You want to pause the video for a second and think, you can go ahead and do that. So, an obvious manifest function, an intended beneficial consequence of having electricity, turning a light on in a dark room, is that it allows us to see, right? The manifest function of having electricity, of having lights inside houses, is that it enabled people to see when it was dark, right? Before we had electricity, people would have to rely on, fireplaces or lanterns, which were a lot more laborious to get started and, ran on gasoline, etc., that could burn out quite quickly. Electricity made it much easier and much simpler to light up rooms. So people could see what they're doing, people could work at home later in the evening. They didn't necessarily need to go to bed when it was dark and wake up with the sunrise to get all their work done during daytime. So that was the intended benefit of having electricity. What's an unintended benefit or a latent function of turning a light on in a dark room? What could be an unintended beneficial consequence of turning a light on in a dark room? Well, one that sociologists often bring up is that if you are at home and you turn a light on when it's late at night, you could scare away a potential burglar, right? If a burglar was in your neighborhood walking around looking for a house to rob, do you think they're going to try and rob the house where their lights are on, which is a symbol for someone being home? Or is the burglar going to try and break into a dark house, which indicates that people are less likely to be home or sleeping, right? So an unintended beneficial consequence of turning a light switch on is that you could scare away a burglar. A latent dysfunction of turning a light switch on in a room, well, while electricity might be great because it helps us see at night, of course we know that it contributes to some environmental concerns. The more electricity we burn, the more energy we're consuming, which could be harmful to our environment, burning holes through the ozone layer, global warming, all that jazz. So that would be an unintended negative consequence of developing electricity, is that while it's great and helps us see more, we weren't expecting it to have such a negative impact on our environment, all right? So that's the difference between manifest functions, latent functions, and latent dysfunctions. When we're talking about structural functionalism, the main theorist that really is given a lot of credit in sociology for developing this particular theory is Emil Durkheim. So Durkheim suggested that in order for society to function, its members must feel interconnected and share a collective consciousness. And he referred to a collective consciousness as a shared set of values, beliefs, and attitudes. So in order for society to function, in order for everyone to be invested in fulfilling the roles and expectations of them to keep society's machine functioning smoothly, people need to embrace this collective consciousness. Essentially, Durkheim is saying we all need to feel like we're part of something larger than ourselves, and we need to be invested in that, right? So members of a society need to feel socially integrated. This is critical to a functionalist perspective. Why would anyone want to be a cog in the machine, right? What is the justification behind that? What would motivate someone to want that? According to Durkheim, it's feeling collective consciousness, it's feeling socially integrated, the degree to which a person feels connected to their social group and society and its collective consciousness. When people are feeling largely socially integrated, that's good for society because we're buying into this idea of collective consciousness and motivates us to complete our functions to help society. But not everyone always feels integrated. A lot of times people feel outcasted, right? And when people feel outcasted, it can become dysfunctional because they might not do what's expected of them. If a society's collective consciousness breaks down or goes through a radical transition, the result is referred to as anomie, a condition of instability wherein members of society feel isolated and unguided. We are experiencing anomie right now with this pandemic, right? The values and the norms that we previously had to inform our behavior, all of a sudden thrown out the window, right? We were told we have to stay at home, we have to social distance, we can't go to the movies, we can't go to restaurants, The norms and the behaviors that were guiding our lives for so long were completely thrown out the window, and it made a lot of us feel very isolated. It made us feel like we weren't really part of this larger society that we were previously established. So that's what anomie refers to. Applying functionalism to gender, a functionalist would suggest that gender is good for society because it provided a clear distribution of labor, right? The idea that men should be in the workforce and that women should stay home ensured that all of the families in our society had their needs met. So gender was very functional because it helped us divvy out the expected tasks for every family unit. Some critiques of functionalism: the theory focuses so much on how societies strive to maintain social order that it doesn't effectively explain how social change takes place. And given its focus on the role of structures, functionalism also downplays the roles of individuals and individual autonomy in our society.